working very hard at too many things, but time just flies. So I had my second cataract removed on Friday, and it's a bit stressful and a bit, I have to be careful not to read too much. So, and a few other things. My daughter-in-law is defending her PhD at the University of Toronto on Friday, and she lives in Montreal. So our house is full, and they're coming in various kind of phalanxes. So, and Henna's preparing for a talk.
Yes, for next week. So, but I mean, these readings are certainly good, and they're certainly helping me engage with this type of thinking more and asking more questions. Yeah, it leaves you with questions.
Oh, Heather, wow. Pat, why didn't you turn on that light so that we can see your face? You did that the other time, and it helped.
Maybe, what do you think, Karen? Turn it off, maybe.
Sure.
I'll turn it off. Yeah, it's a very bright day. Maybe this is better.
Okay, yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Because we don't have any blind on that window.
Heather, do you want to do a sound check? Can you unmute yourself? And
yeah, hi, how are you?
Good. Great.
I have a weird requirement about my participation this morning. It will be different next time, but I'll have to be off video most of the time. I have students coming by to pick up portfolios. So in between, I can be on here and participating, but when I meet with them, I have to be off the screen. So I'll be mostly ghosting in the background, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I may ask you anyway. I guess I'll aim to ask you stuff when you're on video rather than off video.
Sounds good. I'll try to be as present as possible. Thanks for understanding.
There we go. So you're giving a talk, Henna, at U of T or Blurview or?
No, it's a presentation at the Qualitative Inquiry Conference.
Okay.
Next week. It's in Chicago.
Okay.
In Illinois.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I mean, they're certainly talking about, they'll have several workshops around this idea, like what is data, what is method, and how do we rethink concepts as active. So I found this chapter actually really useful. I'm trying to engage with that. I mean,
it really makes us rethink method, and method is such a built into the scientific endeavor that it's an interesting take on things, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, method and the subject, especially when we're within health sciences and everything is centered around the subject or the body, and so trying to reconfigure that in a way where you can still say that you're doing health science research is something that's not easy to answer. Yeah.
And the constant search for evidence that leads pretty immediately to practice.
Yeah.
It's always troubled me. And yet, what is the alternative? There are people who usually need or want healthcare assistance, and they want the latest. And at Blurview, at the Research Institute, there's been a huge push for parent and children's involvement in the framing of questions and in the questions themselves, the research questions, which is not as simple. That also is complicated, very complicated situation. So I'm finding Erin's book. It's brilliant.
We'll do introductions later, but you guys don't know each other. So Heather's, do you want to say a few words about, I don't know, you'll do it later, but Heather's a poet and a writer, I guess. So
Sure.
You, right?
Yeah. So right now my full-time job is working as an instructor at University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and I teach composition courses in the Stretch program here. So, hi, we have somebody new.
Hi there.
Cora.
Hi, Cora. We see half your head.
There, there. Is that better? Sorry, I wasn't paying attention. Hi, everyone. Hi. Henna, you're back. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you.
Hello, Geoffrey.
Hi.
How are things?
Good. I did my prep work. I'm ready for today.
Are you? Well, you're always ready, aren't you?
Yeah, but I worked till 3 a.m. getting it ready. But
How many do we have today?
I don't know. We'll see how many come on. Yeah,
You cut your hair.
I did. Yeah.
That's nice.
I will have to leave promptly at 11 again, at 1 again.
Yeah. I'll try and get this finished by as close to 1 as I can manage, but
And will Erin be joining any more sessions, or was it just for the first
I
time?
think just the 1 session.
Yeah.
She's
That was nice.
It was a nice introduction.
Yeah.
yeah, she's quite busy, so
Yeah.
we were a bit privileged to have her that time. So, and as I'll explain a little bit later on too, I wouldn't say that I could second guess Erin, but I have spent a lot of time with her in the last few years, and have some insight into her ideas. So. Hi, John. Hi, Jocelyne. Good.
Hello.
Jocelyne, do you want to check your sound?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Hey.
Greetings. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Oh, we got some more. Marco, maybe?
It's going to make my dog crazy because she thinks the doorbell's ringing every
I think I'm expecting a couple more people to come in, so we'll give it a couple of minutes and then we'll get started. We could do just, so we did introductions last time, but Heather knows some people here. There's our new person. But maybe just a few words from everybody. So if you've already introduced yourself, you might just say how you're feeling and how it's going with the reading as a kind of check-in. And otherwise, yeah, why don't we just do that? And I'll start. Pat?
Well, it's hard to start, but anyway, I'm a sociologist and I have a background in nursing. I'm very interested in healthcare practices, places, art, philosophy, music, the brain.
Henna?
So I'm Henna. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto, and I'm looking at the experiences of racialized children with autism. And I'm situated, I suppose, more within a critical social science perspective, but I'm moving towards this kind of a Deleuzian understanding of race and children and autism.
Okay, I'm just going to do a sound check with Doug. Do you want to?
Hello, everyone.
Good, thank you. So let's go to Cora.
Hi, everyone. Cora, assistant professor at the School of Nursing at Ryerson University. I think I know everyone here from last time except for Heather. I think she's just stepped away. Is that right?
Well, I think she's still listening, even though she's not actually on the video. But
previous to my career now, I was a dancer with Toronto Dance Theatre, and over the last decade plus, I've been working on merging those two ways of knowing and understanding in terms of the research that we're doing with children with disabilities. To answer to respond to your question, Geoffrey, about the readings, and in particular today's chapter, to me, it's always so interesting in how timely a reading can be. And just as Relationscapes was during my PhD and trying to understand some of what I was sensing and observing with the children moving in a classroom, I feel this chapter really does hone in on some of the problems that we faced then. I'm sure you felt that way as well too, Pat, when we were writing that together, and Geoffrey. And even more so now as I've moved on to another project and study, and how I'm still pressing against some of the same problems in terms of method, and to read about this in this kind of detail and understanding from Erin's perspective, again, really affirms, and at the same time makes me fidget and struggle as well too, because it's complex and really engaging with the material. So I look forward to talking about it more today.
Great. Marco, do you just want to do a sound check?
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. John, why don't you go?
Yeah, well, basically, I have a history as a gay activist and AIDS activist. I worked in a lot of gay organizations. So I was very political at one time in my career. And I also worked a lot with elderly and with persons with dementia. And so I have a real interest, and I also live in New York. I live in Manhattan, where I see a lot of what I would call cannibal capitalism run amok. So I'm very aware of different models and that I've used, and how they've shaped my the way I observe and participate. And I also am aware of, I also have created certain models in sort of impromptu situations. So I'm very interested in all those overlaps between different groups and identities and orientations, and how we continue to try to make sense of our complex social world. So that's what I very much enjoy this particular book and Erin's writing, because she seems to be very drawn to these strange overlaps, and how do we articulate from those unusual spaces that we get into with others. So thank you for this opportunity.
I'm going to keep track of that word strange overlaps, because I think it describes the group as well. Jocelyne?
Me? Well, I teach at Laval University. I'm mainly a musician, but I work also with 3D interactive animation. And I used to work with small children who had dysphasia. And when I read this, I mean, it's the first chapter, but I call it the second. I don't know in my, I learned a lot about how it could be easy when I read the first chapter, when it was easy to enter in a specific model, and how it is also not so easy to fight against that. And I was very happy to read this chapter, because I feel like there is people who are taking some voices. I mean, Erin is talking about all these issues that mainly we live in our intimacy, and it's difficult to express, and she gave a voice to all of this, and I felt very moved by that. Of course, I have some part of it where I would like to discuss more, but I think that it's like a discovery that some people are close to what I deeply think. So I would say, like, I'm pleased, and at the same time I'm amazed and almost shocked to see that I'm so close to this area, because I thought I was alone of thinking that.
I can relate to that.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll get more into some of those issues, I think. Doc, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, I guess my primary occupation right now is father. I just had a child on Thursday, so less than a week old. Everything's going well, except I'm not sleeping. So I feel jittery and jumbled, and so I want to just relax today and listen in on what everyone else has to say. I did really enjoy this chapter, and that's something I've been working on the past 2 or 3 years, I guess, without having terms for it in the act or other terms that I can't think of right now. But it's kind of the point of my life right now, is to get away from the systems of life and just create fresh from each, not necessarily each moment, but see each gathering as a good chance for creating something new and amazing. That's all.
Thanks. Marco?
Well, I don't know what to say exactly. By way of very, very broad introduction, although I think I gave it somewhat last week, I'm a writer, a poet, an editor, co-founder and organizer of Metapsychosis Journal and Cosmos Cooperative, this co-op that we're forming, for which we have a placeholder, not yet an organization, and certainly not a method or a model exactly. And I am drawn to Erin's work because I see a reflection of a lot of things that I'm concerned with and challenges that I'm facing in my own process as an artist. And this chapter that we read this week in particular, I think, addresses some of those specifically around the topic of research creation and practices of knowing and neurodiverse kinds of experiences that can give rise to forms, but can't arise if they're predetermined by externally imposed forms. And that whole move from a sort of pre-formatted approach to experience or to practice or whatever it is, forming an organization, publishing a journal, writing a poem, the move from the pre-formatted to the emergent, what comes through the assemblage and the actuality of the gathering of forces and energies, known, unknown, effable and ineffable. I mean, that to me is the essence. That's the heart of creation and of life as well. So to bring thought to that experience, and to understand thought as a force that is in play in that experience, not as a kind of outside ordering principle, although there is an ordering involved, I think is a powerful antidote to the ways that, you know, we, broadly speaking, but also myself specifically, learned how to do things, including do life. So that's what I'm particularly interested in this conversation. And I'm getting over a cold. Last time Erin was here, she was sick, and I noted that I wondered if I would get sick, and I did. But that's not, I'm not directly causally tying those events together. I'm just noticing the fact that I noticed an identification, I noticed a condition, and then the condition arose in my own experience. And that's all. Anyhow, if my voice is gravelly or low, or my energy is weird, it's because of that.
Interesting, because I have a cold now, so I don't know if it's virally in both senses of the word.
Well, thought is infectious.
I'll give Heather a chance when she comes back. What I am going to do, though, is I'm proposing to do is to give about a 20-minute overview of what I see as the main arguments of the chapter, and then we can come back over particular issues. It's quite a complex chapter, so I thought a kind of an overview approach would maybe help situate things. I'd like to begin by noting that in addition to the reading and the working that I did along with Pat, Cora, who are present here, because we did work together. Cora was working on her PhD thesis, Pat was supervising it, and I was involved as part of the committee. And we worked heavily on Aaron Manning's ideas in the period between about 2009 and 2012, roughly. 2012 to 2013, maybe. So that was my initial encounter with Aaron's work. But then after that, in 2014, I contacted her in Montreal. And at the time, she was in the process of setting up, giving a class in the spring of 2015 on Whitehead's Process and Reality. And so what I did was I essentially committed to going to that class for the entire duration of the session. So it was quite intense. Aaron at last time talked about the fact the sort of role of my participation in the class in terms of how the other students saw that profs could work together and that another prof could be interested in what's going on in a class like that. But it wasn't just going down the hall. It was a 3-hour drive each way, plus the class itself. So I had to commit an entire day, and in some cases 2 days, because I would stay overnight, to these encounters. So it was a fairly major engagement on my part. So much of what she talked about during that class, I now see written into the book. So in a way, the class, which was about Whitehead and process, strongly informed what she did in the book itself. So I'm hoping that because of that association with Aaron and some of the germinal ideas that went into this book, that I'll be able to give some insights into what she, without taking her place. Heather, do you want to give a short introduction about yourself to the group?
I can, Geoffrey, or I can also post it in the forum online if we've moved on to a topic already.
No, I think I'd like to hear
your
thoughts about yourself and the book as well.
Excellent. Okay, so I apologize for jumping on and off. I do have a couple more student meetings before the end of the call today, so I This just happened to overlap my portfolio return time. But I teach at University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. I'm in my first year here, and I teach composition courses. And I graduated over last summer with my Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing and Poetics from Naropa University. And I worked before that as a Writing Center Director at California Institute of Integral Studies. So I've been really lucky to have a tour of 2 excellent alternative institutions that I was really excited about. And I got to experience them more deeply. And what I'm loving about the book right now, and my background is in rhetoric and composition, so I have a kind of a strange combination of rhetoric and poetics. I guess it's strange. I'm learning to make sense of it. But what I'm loving about the book right now is, so it feels like the right book at the right time, and that's always a good sign. This chapter in particular really speaks to some of my professional concerns when she's talking about artistic research or research, thinking about research and art together. And I'm trying to redefine through my own scholarship some things in my field to allow creative writing to have, to refigure method in rhetoric and composition. So I'm interested in like creative composition. That's something I've been trying to work on. And in my dissertation, I had also explored the process philosophers. So Whitehead is another interest, and I like what he's in conversation with. Radical empiricism, something that a friend's been telling me I need to learn more about. So, and then from Naropa, in the preface, her Moten and Harney references to the Undercommons. That's a book I've been needing to read for a while. So it's been recommended. Fred Moten just came to Naropa this semester. So all of this feels really relevant for me. And her style, I really like her. I'm really liking the energy of her writing. There's a really good feeling, especially in the preface or in the intro. And the writing with has been a question that I've been working on for about 7 or 8 years, the meaning of what it means to write with. So I just feel like I'm in the right place, but I'm sorry I'm not very present on the call this morning.
Thank you. That was super. So chapter 1, Against Method, is it's both about an approach, but I also wanted to note that to some extent it's a kind of a portrait. It's a kind of a description of a person who does this work at the boundary between research and creation. So it's got a bit of both those elements in it. She begins by noting that talking about this concept of research creation, which is a kind of a Canadian, or it comes out of the Canadian context. Jocelyne mentioned earlier something about this, and certainly in the sort of, so Jocelyne is in a music department in which research, in a Canadian university, in which research creation has a major role to play. And there are many people who write about research creation in different ways. And depending on who they are as a person and the context, they say things that can be quite different about research creation. So Erin's taking a particular point of view with regard to research creation that's different from the sort of canon in the Canadian context about what research creation is. And she introduces both the work through criticism of the way things are done in the Canadian context, but also introduces the notion of minor gesture into this. I'm going to read a couple of passages. She says, "I would like to take seriously that research creation does much more than what the funding agencies had in store for it. It generates new forms of experience. It tremulously stages an encounter for disparate practices, giving them a conduit for collective expression. It hesitantly acknowledges that normative modes of inquiry and containment often are incapable of assessing its value. It generates forms of knowledge that are extra-linguistic. So I wanted to insist on this idea that part of what she's talking about are phenomena that are outside the domain of the linguistic. It creates an opening for what Moten and Harney conceptualize as the undercommons. It creates the conditions for new ways of encountering study, forms and forces of intellectuality that cut across normative accounts of what it means to know. New forms of knowledge require new forms of evaluation, and even more so, new ways of valuing the work we do. So that's another theme that comes back into her discussions, is the role of evaluation and valuing, which is a somewhat different concept than evaluation. Also in this last quote, the term the cut comes in, and the cut is a key concept that Erin comes back to again and again in her text, but it's not an easy context. It's not an easy concept to catch. So I'll come back to the question of the cut a little bit later on. It's one of the things that Whitehead discusses in his work. The first major section in the text is, so the text is divided up into 6 subsections, each of which is called an immanent critique. And the first is on matter. Erin draws on Whitehead and James' writings. So we're talking about we're talking about Whitehead, and then William James' work in radical empiricism, to discuss the split between mind and matter. So the first section is on the split between mind and matter, and the fact that Whitehead and James refuse to break things up that way, that they reject the distinction between subject and object to begin with. And they also reject the distinction between knower and known, which is a different way of looking at that distinction. So Erin identifies this reorganization as the heart of experience and the source of technique, technique being a mode of action that occurs across the divide between knower and known, or across in a reorganization of knower and known. She says the reason why the bifurcation of nature is always creeping back into scientific philosophy is the extreme difficulty of exhibiting the perceived redness and warmth of the fire in one system of relationships with the agitated models of molecules of carbon and oxygen, with the radiant energy from them, and with the various functions of the material body. Unless we produce the all-embracing relations, we are faced with a bifurcated nature, namely warmth and redness on one side, and molecules, electrons, and ether on the other side. To reorient towards the radically empirical is to profoundly challenge the knower-known relation as it is customarily defined. Neither the knower nor the known can be situated in advance of the occasion's coming to be. Both are immanent to the field's composition. Nor can the knower-known relation be classified independently of the ecologies that compose it, including those whose register is unquantifiable, such as the quality or effective tonality of experience. This is the force of radical empiricism. It gives us a technique to work with the inact at the heart of experience, providing subtle ways of composing with the shifting relations between knower and known. It is important to reiterate, the knower is not the human subject, but the way relations open themselves towards systems of subjectification. In Immanent Critique 2 on reason, she explores the role of reason in relation to this redefinition of the of the relationship between knower and known. She begins by critiquing method as a hierarchical categorization process focused around linguistic meanings. She points out that this maintains the separation between the knower and the known, in the sense that things are known in advance, but that this excludes other forms of knowledge, extra-linguistic forms of knowledge, neuroatypical forms of knowledge. Even it excludes the process of living itself, as opposed to reflections about the process of living. She then suggests that reason may be viewed not in its judgmental traditional way, but as, and she calls it, the art of life, which is a quote from Whitehead. This makes reason dynamic, unfolding, never to be guessed in advance, and hence it opposes it to method. And there's a long, I have dozens of quotes there, but I'm just going to read one. Whitehead begins by defining the function of reason in opposition to the godlike faculty which surveys, judges, and understands as the art of life. The Kantian definition of reason, which has left its imprint on contemporary understanding of reason, is here cast aside for a strange and compelling account of reason as the appetite for the cut of difference. And this is this notion of cut that comes back into it. So cut is a kind of an intrusion or a way of cutting across thought patterns across many different areas in a dynamic way rather than in a static way. So anyway, we can come back to it again. The next section is called On Thought. Aaron extends the argument about reason to notice that thought cannot be outside experience. Method tries to situate thought outside experience. And consequently, that the I cannot be located via predefinition. And she quotes Nietzsche, "I don't concede that the I is what thinks. I take the I itself to be a construction of thinking." And I was thinking about this, so it's, I think, therefore I am, rather than I think, therefore I am. So the emphasis is on the construction of the I, rather than the construction of the notion of being there. I is the movement of thought destabilized by the act, the coming into itself of a capacity to regulate experience, but only until it is destabilized again by the minor gestures coursing through the event. This does not, of course, mean that there is no I. It just means that the I cannot be located in advance of the event, that the I is always in the midst, active in the relational field as one of the vectors of the inactive experience. I am is always, to a large degree, was that me? In section 4 on technique, Aaron explores the nature of technique, not as a tool for achieving a desired goal, but as a process for engaging with what she calls the anarchical. And she notes that it's necessarily messy. In the section 5 on research creation, she comes back to the question of research creation, but she now points out that it brings together this rejection of the distance between the knower and the known, the redefined notion of reason as the art of life in opposition to method, the abandonment of the I as predefined, and the presence of technique as messy and anarchical. James writes, against the relationalistic tendency to treat experience as chopped up into discontinuous static objects, radical empiricism protests. It insists on taking conjunctions at their face value, just as they come. Consider, for example, such conjunctions as and, with, near, plus, towards. While we live in such conjunctions, our state is one of transition in the most literal sense. Transition doesn't mean pure, unconstrained becoming. It means flow and cut, discontinuity and difference. So again, this term cut, which is related to this idea of difference. And finally, in the last section, she links this train of ideas to the ideas of Felix Guattari. In particular, his idea of a meta model, which I think is, so the word meta model is being used within the Cosmos co-op because it came out of another context as well, but I don't think it's quite the same concept here. The notion of meta model upsets notions of power and knowledge. It links back to the idea of the undercommons, which is the emergent collectivity that challenges. Knowledge is fundamentally singular because of the knower-known dynamic. That is to say, knowledge resides in the knower-known interaction. And this is where the minor gesture comes in, within this singularity at the heart of this convergence. At base, schizoanalysis only poses one question: how does one model oneself? Minor gestures operate at this cusp where the non-conscious and the conscious co-compose, where language operates beneath the words, as Osistic Amelia Baggs might say. From this position of indeterminacy, of the ineffable, how to make intelligible the singularity of what cannot be measured or categorized, but is felt and in some sense known. So that's a quick run through of some of the arguments in this first chapter. It's quite a complex argument, and I felt it was important to go through and name the different parts of it. Also, Erin has said in her own writings and readings about this work that she feels the work needs to be read aloud. And so I've done that throughout the presentation to go back. And it's one of the things we notice about when we read Deleuze or when we read Whitehead or James, that you kind of, you can rephrase the work in your own ways, but you often have to go back and reread it in the original in order to check that you've rethought it and recomposed it in ways that honor the original text. So again, I think that's an important point. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor to reactions, comments, personal anecdotes, whatever comes in to the discussion. I've also muted people, but it's only to stop the background noise. You just have to unmute yourself in order to speak.
Well, I can begin, Geoffrey. And if people don't mind sort of indulging just in this short piece in terms of what we did with the PhD and what currently is going on with a grant that has followed and extended the findings from the PhD as a kind of context to this. What I love about reading Erin and her ideas is that it's not something that I have to take and apply, but in fact, in our particular encounters with children, these ideas have actually emerged from what we've been seeing. So it's a kind of affirmation and an understanding of what we might be seeing and what happened in terms of method. And I think when we did the PhD, we were caught in this structure of, and Pat, you can jump in here anytime, in terms of presenting a PhD that would be acceptable in terms of its methodological approaches, its the necessary requirements to defend, validate, and create a piece of work that the nursing faculty would accept in Toronto. But in the meantime, we have all of these emergences, these encounters with young children that are beyond words. I thought that I could address that more as a dancer than as a nurse, but in the same context, there were no words to describe what was happening between the children. I think we found quite an elegant balance in the end with the PhD in being able to meet those requirements essentially to have the PhD accepted and defended. And at the same time played with these ideas, and this was coming mainly from Erin's ideas from relationscapes, which obviously are crossing over into this work now. Where I find myself caught now is that in extending these findings, if I had been smart, I probably would have taken a little bit more time to let these ideas and the understanding of what method is, the way that Erin is talking about method, that method essentially emerges as we go, as opposed to applying a method going in. And when I'm pushed in certain ways, especially in terms of funding now to extend these findings, I found myself mired again within a particular methodological framework because that's what I needed to do. And I speak even in the extension of ethics as well too. When you're working with disabled children, there's a demand that I need to know what I'm doing, what I'm going to say, how I'm going to move with these children, how I'm going to keep them safe. And I have put this into words, into a method, knowing it's like living two different lives. I'm two different people. When I go into that, all of that falls away because I really don't know what's going to happen when those children encounter one another. And it's frightening in some ways. I'd walk into that room knowing that I had no clue what was going to happen, but it's exactly what she's talking about. It's this method that emerges from this. It's the encounters that I never could have described. And now still I have these encounters that I still don't know how to describe. So it is in the cadence. There's this beautiful passage, and Pat, I think this is where we struggled together in the PhD on top of page 39. How does the rhythm, the cadence, the intensity of the text compose with its words? Where does thought, feeling escape or resist existing forms of knowledge? And again on page 42, research creation does not need new methods. What it needs is a reaccounting of what writing can do in the process of thinking, doing. And she goes on to say that this is the paradox. We're excited about the openings research creation provides and yet remain largely unwilling to take them on their own terms and experiment with them as new modes of existence and new forms of knowledge. I want to experiment with them. It's not that I'm unwilling. I want to. In fact, they come to me as opposed to me presenting something to them. However, I'm caught, and especially at this stage in my career as well too, I'm surrounded by an institution and people and thinkers that demand a more pre-thought methodology, a means of evaluating. How can I count this? What can I do with this? How does this look? What does this look like on paper? How can I share this with other people? And I don't know. I don't know at this stage in my career, when I'm constantly being, it's insisted that I produce this in a particular way, and I'm still caught in the words of Erin that I embrace. So that's my concern. I think probably I went into this new research project too soon. Perhaps I should have thought this through a little bit more, but now I'm caught again in having to produce what I said I would do. And meanwhile, there's all of this other wonderful anti-method that is going on that is of the essence of these children and what they're doing. So what would Erin say to this then? Especially at my stage in my career, how do I work with these ideas when, and I would say Jocelyne as well too, you feel like an island. I feel totally alone, other than this group of people that I know some of you very, very well and others of you not so well. But it's comforting to be in the conversation and the company of people that can support this and understand this tension.
So in the moments where I guess you're kind of between the creative side of the unknown and maybe, I don't know if you term it as anxiety, as like, where do I go with this, or what can I do? And clearly, a lot of us have noticed we're singular agents within this environment, no matter where we are. But within your context, without the support, do you feel it would be helpful to have more experience? Like maybe on down the road in 10 years, you'll have that knowledge and have better grasp of what you need to do.
Yeah, I don't think it's a matter of having more knowledge. I think it's about having the freedom to be able to work in this way and think in this way and write in this way. Now, I'll go ahead and do it anyways. Of course I will, because I feel committed and passionate about these ideas. But it is at a particular stage right now where it's very difficult to press against some of the structures that are powerful and very traditional in holding ideas and knowledge in a particular way. So it's not about gaining more, well, it is. I mean, we're always learning and gaining more knowledge in particular ways, but it's more about having the freedom to be able to think and work in this way. I mean, Geoffrey, does it change over time, especially at your point in your career? Pat, does it change at this point where perhaps those sort of structures and walls are maybe more penetrable? I'm not sure.
Speaking, I'm approaching my 70th birthday, and I can only say, for me, my thinking has become much more complicated, much less trustworthy. I feel much less sure. So, but I would like, I don't know, Geoffrey, if you want to add anything, maybe, maybe my trajectory is different than yours. And I don't want to get into detail about this, but I was catastrophically brain injured just as Cora was finishing her thesis. And I can remember, I've been thinking a lot about the brain, the mind, the soul, the body. Where are these things? What are these things? And one day when I was still in rehab, a group of physicians came in to my room and asked me what I was doing. And I said, I'm reading the Globe and Mail. And they were shocked. And they said, but you can't possibly be understanding. Are you understanding anything? And I said, you're asking me to use my brain and my thinking to look at itself and judge whether or not it's understanding. How would I know? It was an amazing experience.
Mm-hmm.
So that just gives a little connecting point to my story.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we can just, as I learned as a nurse 40 years ago, as a practitioner and as a human being, one can only do what one thinks at the moment is the best, or is the most just, or is the most fair, is the most ethical. Maybe that's too much, but.
Well, Cora, I've had some similar concerns just because I've recently had to put in my my REV in and my application in, and like you said, you have to fit it within this model. And as I've been engaging with similar types of work, like with post-qualitative literature, which says a similar thing. It says anti-method, or just a different way of approaching method. And as well as the human and agency. And so I'm at this point where I'm like, where do I belong? This won't translate within the department I'm in. And yeah, at the same time, do I want to be limited by that? Like, I'd like to take this opportunity to take this as far as I can, but who will recognize it? And I guess the questions about like, so is this the type of research I should be engaging in if it doesn't allow me to do or go in this direction as well? So yeah.
So I think that everybody in this virtual room sits on this boundary between the structured world that would like everything to be organized into predefined categories, and this emergent world where things have to be done on the fly, not because one is unorganized and unable to do things another way, but because on the fly is where the pulse of the work needs to take place, right? So the academics here, but there are also people like Johnny or Marco, who has a different relationship, or Heather, who has a relationship also with an institution. So I just perhaps I know, Jocelyne, you wanted to say something. Why don't you? Anyway.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, what I would like to say is that I come up with the same feeling. I don't know if it is an idea, but the same feeling that Cora exposed, which is that there is the academic world where we expected to have some methods in order to treat a problem. And the methods imply that you have to be, that this method could be reproduced to something else, to someone else, in order to solve the issues. And the conclusion, that if we can come up with a conclusion as a result of all this tentative of trying to find a method, is that, well, method cannot be applied to solve the same problems for something related to mental health, or something related to social health, or something related to health even, because we have something that is very ontologically rooted that have to change with time. And anyway or anyhow you find a method, it's always related to someone who will interpret the method and try to apply it or not, and the models is just making no sense in that way. So when we talk about creation, which is one part of the first chapter that Erin described in the chapter 1, I don't know why I mixed up with chapter 1, chapter 2, but there was the introduction and this one is chapter 1. She's talking about research creation. And this part really deeply called me, because I am in the department where we're supposed to do research creation, as you said, and we do not. In fact, when I read that, I realized that we are not in the topic at all. We're doing something, but it's not related to what Erin present. And what she's presented is really a switch of paradigms in the way we think about science, in the way we think about arts, in the way of we are trying to solve issues when we're trying to reach together. And it's really called me, because I was like, you know, I think that we need to talk about that. We need to explain more the concept that were exposed here, because we are not in the right direction. And I'm not talking only about my department, but the other ones who's trying to do something close in social science and anything related to human. Why? First, I wanted to say something. I don't know if I have the time to do that, but I wanted to say something about the terminology research creation. that for a long time, just cut me if it is too long, but for a long time, we assumed that creation was God. And we assume that cannot be part as a human, as the creation was just the gesture, the end of the gesture of God. And we cannot relate it to God as artists, as creation, as people who do the creations. It's God who does the creation, basically, and we are just presenting some part of this expression. Then can, the history, and we become the artist ourselves. And when in this dynamic, no one explains what creation is. No one has the methodology to explain what is creation. It's always a hidden part, the black box, the part that where we cannot explain. Marx, when trying to explain the gesture of human creation, he said, well, we put God apart because we cannot explain it, and then we will work on human only. So we cut this part we did not deeply understand, but we decided, well, this part we cannot understand is too, and it's not about understanding, is too ideologically difficult to talk about, so we will not talk about that, and we will focus on what is the production of human, and we will look at the results, and it's the concept of art as an object came this way. But today, we are not in the object anymore. Well, we are, but we are more in the process of the object. And in this process, we have to come back to what is the creation, what is, or how we can produce that, where it's coming from. And when she talks about the method, that we should not be inside a method that is an anti-method, she really put the things upside down for the good purpose of trying to find a way of what is really the creation, and how it is related to social interaction, how it is related to our well-being, how it is related to a way to interact with others. And all of this is create a switch of paradigm that is really deep. And it's not something simple. I remember a book that I read when I was doing my PhD called, sorry, it's in French, but it's Traité of Harmony, and it was a musician of the director of my department of music in University Paris 8, and she was very well known. And when she came with an anti-traité method, and musicians are all about methodology, how we compose music, and there is some rules and this and that, she said, I try to put that on the computer, it's not working, so methods are not working, and people have to talk about it. People have to explain it. Of course, it was not taking the whole gesture, the whole artistic gesture as a whole, but it was, talking about what we're doing wrong. And the one thing I would like to say is the way Erin talks about the concept. She said concept, the way we thought about it, it was like an object, and now it's more like a process. And she quotes Whitehead. I know Whitehead is very difficult. Anytime she quotes Whitehead, I have to go back in the book and try to, oh my God, I did not understand properly this sentence, and go back and trying to, fix the things all together. But it's really about the process. It's really about how we process things. And as a human being, when you understand, when we look at what kind of method we have to reach a process, and when we talk about method, is to catch the features, trying to reproduce it, and trying to validate it by generalization. Well, we cannot do that with a human process. It's so larger than us. And we are looking at unit as we are a unit, you are a unit, and we're trying to understand the process like this as we understand computer science. But we are in the wrong way. And Erin put that in words in a way that I was amazed, because she's saying things so simplistically with concepts that are very complicated. And I was, like saying that it's really the way to go. She gave clues on how to do it. And I suggest that, from my point of view, the hypothesis that hair should be treated as it is, and we should practically try it, you know, putting it, implement it, trying to do something out of it, because I don't see other way right now to do things. We are kind of stuck with methods that we have to use, statistical methods. I tried myself, like artificial intelligence, and of course it's great, of course it's beautiful, but if you don't have a clue of how to, what kind of data you're going to enter in it, which is related to the method, which is which was critiqued by Erin for the right, in the right way, well, you are using the tools without knowing the process. And this process is different from each other. We don't have the same process, all of us, even if we are in the same way of thinking. And it's really called the work I did with you, Geoffrey, about the ontological way of thinking, you know, thinking of a person in his own time and his own production. I think we need a tool, and when I say tool, it's not really the word, but we need to grasp something that is able to showing that we should not think with regular methods that we used to have, but to find something else that is more friendly with the process. Sorry for taking so long to talk.
So when Jocelyne is talking about ontology there, she's talking about it, referring it to a discussion we have where ontology is related to the temporal change of things. So the sort of ontology as the ontology of an individual as the individual evolves over time. So it's a somewhat different idea about ontology than the sort of classical theory about the world kind of ontology. It's much closer to Erin's kind of approach on things. Doug, you were going to say something?
Just real quick, do you have the name of the author for that? The anti-treaty of whatever, harmony?
Yes, it was, it's Evelyn Andreani. And I will maybe put it in the chat, the references. It's Evelyn Andreani, and it was a book written during the 90s, the 90s. And she wrote about how to do music without, how we should not take the rules that we give to musicians and find something else to do the music, that the method we use are killing the creativity, are killing the way we, basically what she said, and mainly in her conferences, is that when you teach music to kids and they have the way, like an intuitive way of playing the music, and you teach them these rules, you kill the creativity. Of course, you build them as a virtuoso and they will play Bach perfectly, and they will excel in music. And you will be happy with that as you want a copy. But if you want to express creativity, you should not give them this type of rules that are very, articulate in the norms and the way we process to compose the music. We should not give that to them, because that will compromise them. And people say to her, well, the rules of the way a composer do his music is mainly trying to escape from the rules. So it's good to have the rules at first, because without rules you cannot go nowhere. But she retalked to that. She said back to this person, you should not think this way, because you never see, you don't know what a musician without these kind of rules can do. And I had example around me, and it's a whole different world, and it should be cultivated. And after that, when they find themselves, they can go to this path. I will put how can I say? I will put the references on the chat like this, so we can share it. Unfortunately, it's a book in French, but maybe she did the translation. I will look to that.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that. I just have one quick comment and I'll let others speak, but yeah, I'm interested in the opposite side. I actually need more structure. I need more rules. So I understand what Aaron's getting at here. Like my son, we have a little keyboard and we will create games rather than actually learning the structure. I don't have any background in piano, so it's a game, but at the same time, I want him to develop some sort of structure. So the question I had from what you said, which we don't have to answer now, but it's one that's been kind of percolating in a lot of areas in my life and on the Infinite Conversations website, is kind of how do we discover the tools or whatever processes to, like, can we have a set of tools for like a universal tools, or does it always have to be individual? Does it have to cater to each particular group, or can there be something that we all grasp on? But see, you want to talk, John?
You want me to answer? I could answer if you want.
Not necessarily, no. I just wanted to throw it out there. Just let it.
I did want to say, Erin's not saying no structures. She's saying no predefined structures. The structures need to emerge from what you're doing. So it's not quite the same thing as saying it's unstructured.
Yeah.
Don, you wanted to?
Yes, I would like to respond. Thank you. To several things that have been brought up. Working in organizations and working as a private, like a consultant, and the differences between. I wanted to say a little story about that, a personal experience. And I also want to connect this with a lot that's already been brought up about a model, a theory, a technique, a process, and what happens when you go meta theory, meta model, and what are the interactions between theory and model. There's a lot of gaps, I believe, in our terminology. And each of us has to figure this out as we work with others, as we work with organizations that have rules and regulations. And the choices that we have to make, which are not written up in any manual. And then we have to file reports based upon our actual experience with certain clients who we have to advocate on their behalf because they cannot do so for themselves. Then what happens? So, and then I want to bring this back to what Geoffrey was talking about, as he quoted Aaron about the anarchical and the messy and the conjunctions, being in between in a transition, a flow and a cut. And who makes the cut? How do we know the cut? And my experience as I'm working with persons with Alzheimer's, elderly people in their 90s, who are in institutions, and I'm an advocate on their behalf, but I don't work for the institution. I work for the family or the lawyer who is responsible for this person's care and well-being. So I'm an agent, actually. So I can enter into an institution where my client is to be taken care of, and I can notice discrepancies. If I walk in and I see feces on the sheets, blood on the carpet, a bruise on the client I'm there to advocate on her behalf, I have to make some decisions. I have to go into the system and I have to ask questions about who reported this, when was it reported, what decisions were made, and by whom. And when I would get nothing but obstruction, then I would call the family and I say, this is what I saw, this is what reports that I've been given, and take it from there. And then the family would then have to interact with those other members of this organization. I have worked for some of these institutions. And I know if you see an issue and you report it, you may lose your job. Whistleblowers are punished by these institutions. So I'm just saying, with all of that, and you're working with someone with Alzheimer's or memory loss or hearing loss, some sort of impairment, how does this person make a cut? It varies from moment to moment for most of us. But when you're working with someone you're in an intersubjective space with this person and you don't know how they can make a cut because their syntax is scrambled and they can't make a sentence. And you have to advocate on their behalf. You have to figure out, well, what are the aches and the pains that they're describing and where are they coming from? And I have to decide, oh, it's just indigestion, or maybe I need to take her to an emergency room. So those are the kind of very confusing and ambiguous areas that you can read all the manuals and take all the courses you want, but those are not going to be dealt with. Anyway, a particular client that I worked with, this was a private client, so I wasn't, the organizations that I've worked with have it's very important for them. You should not get involved with your clients. It's very important. And they want to schedule everybody in such a way as to disrupt too much relationship. They want to keep it task-oriented. Enough of relationship, but not too much. But it was a real liberation for me to be outside of an organization that demanded these kinds of restrictions and constraints. And when I worked privately with a client and I got to know them extremely well, and I have the trust of their family, it was a very different kind of experience. And I had one moment, and I just want to share this personal anecdote. I had worked with this client for a couple of years, and I knew her very well. And I had seen her, I'd seen certain capacities get, more and more disrupted. And the flow and the cut were very difficult to discern. And her speech was extremely poor. And I'm probably the only one who understood her. And people ask me, well, what did she say? And I would say, I don't know what she said. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we're in a flow together. And that we keep that game going. Because that gives her a great sense of connection. And that she's riding on waves of affect and emotion and trust and distrust. And I have to make up Broadway songs I would sing. I would dance a jig. I would get her to move in order to just create a sense of safety. So one day I came home after a hard day of work and I opened my mailbox and there was a letter. And it was addressed to me from this particular person, this client. And I was astonished. And it was handwritten. And I opened it up, and the letter said, "You make me feel so warm." And I put the letter down and I just started to cry. Because first of all, and I had to figure this out. I thought she had to find a piece of paper. She had to find a pen. She had to find an envelope. She had to find a stamp. She had to write the letter physically. She had to write my address on that letter. She had to find a place to mail it. How did she do this? Because this woman was like, she didn't know what day it was. She didn't know if it was nighttime or daytime. She didn't know when to eat, So I had to go through this list of all the things she had to figure out in order to make this letter happen. And that she did persuaded me that there was a whole lot going on in this woman's interior world and was being noted by all the multiple observers around her. So that's a very humbling experience for me, and a very beautiful experience, because as I talk about it, I have to stop myself from wanting to cry again because she was such an angelic person, and it's an affective thing. It's not a cognitive thing or a map that I'm drawing upon. This is like something in my body mind that it's a great resource, because whenever I feel like shit and confused and baffled, I just think of this heroic little lady who was able to mail me a letter and tell me that I made her life feel warm. That's a great feeling. And one of the great rewards, I think, for working with these ineffable zones we get into, where we have to figure out the flow and the cut. Anyway, thank you for helping me to sort of reorganize myself around these very complex human dilemmas that all of us are in to some extent. So thank you.
So I may be saying something obvious, but I think the questions that John was asking, who defines the cut, and is one of the key arguments within Erin's texts. So the way she brings the cut back to the undercommons. So the issues of engagement in the social issues are key, because the idea of the cut is a Kantian idea, but in Kant's approach to the cut is these predefined categories that are defined ahead of time, and of course they evacuate all of this stuff that John was talking about. So in order to go into the messiness of everyday life, we have to abandon the Kantian approach and embrace this much more dynamic, intrusive, undefined, ineffable approach, right? And I think John's lessons are extremely important for us academics, because we tend to be stuck in a world which acts as if the ineffable wasn't important at all. And we ourselves in our own thinking are affected by this world that we function in. And we get ourselves stuck into that kind of mentality. So I think it's important that we be brought back to this messiness, this immediacy, this imminency, as Erin talks about. Go ahead, Jocelyne.
I just would like to add something and try to not to answer, but to comment on the question. Well, I didn't say that we don't need structure. I think we do need structure. Music is all about structure. It's more about what Erin presented in the book, as we have some methodology that is set up for fixed things, for object, for subject. And the way we think about this method cannot be useful for process where subject, object could not be defined in the same way, where we should redefine our way of thinking for this and apply maybe other methodology. This methodology are not yet to come, but our work is to go toward that. And from my point of view, what John said about his experience as a person that it was so emotional is a way to go, because it's only with trueness, with true feeling what we are, that we can find paths to go towards that, and not thinking about, oh, what is the reification of this process? How can I, do a method in order to grab that? Because we will be misled in a way that we are not able to use this this method for someone. So in Erin's book, what she said about recherche-création, it's all about process, how we process things. And when she's talking about not trying to find other methods, it's not to get out the structure, but it's not to trying to find the same structures that we already have, but to go toward another way of thinking. Not thinking of self as unit, but more as someone who can create links. That links can create knowledge, and not the knowledge as an object, not a method as an object that we can add up as a building blocks and build something. So it's what I would wanted to add, because saying we don't want structure is not what she said, and it's not what I would like. I may say things that was not really what I wanted to say. What I wanted to say is we need to find another way to think about ourselves, another way to think about the relationship we have to others. And for that, I think Erin gave us some nice clues about how to do it. And I think the witness that John gave us is also a way to go, like with talking about how we felt, how the relationship was with one other person. I think it's more this way that is guiding us to how we should think ourselves. So my point of view.
I think as well too that what I've been thinking about more, and in really immersing myself in her writing again, is about how do we, which is a kind of method, I guess, or I'm not quite sure how to describe it, because again, there's probably not many words, but it's about setting the conditions. How do we set up the conditions, or a kind of structuring, or a kind of scaffolding for these kinds of things to take place, for this kind of thing that we cannot predict, the kinds of encounters that happen and go off on their own lines of flight. So there is that structuring in setting up the conditions, or a kind of set of circumstances in which people can encounter one another. And I'm very excited about that. I don't know how to write that, because in a sense, that is a kind of method. It's just simply setting up the circumstances in which people might encounter each other in a different way. So that's something that I'm thinking about and grappling with as well too, and how to articulate something like that. Because I think we've been witness to that, especially in the study with young children, and with what I'm doing now research-wise, that it is a kind of scaffolding, structuring, that allows for something else to happen. So a territorialization that becomes deterritorialized, not because I orchestrated it, but because of the encounter that we can't predict, because of the imminent, because of the pre-acceleration of the energy of that are inside these children's bodies that is there. It's real, but it comes into view because of the kind of encounter that I can't predict. And there's another event that's going on at the university now where I'm just bringing two different groups of people together, dancers and nurses. So I've set the structure for something that I don't know what's going to happen. And that can be really terrifying as well too. Like sometimes I walk into the room and I feel terrified because I can't control it. And I can't dictate what's going to happen, but I'm terribly excited about it as well. So I hope in some ways I'm honoring and understanding in some way what she is perhaps suggesting to do as well.
So I was also thinking about this question about structure and knowledge. So, I mean, knowledge, I think she talks about pragmatic knowledge and speculative knowledge. I think that's right, at some point in her text. So when you dance, Cora, or when I write, we have a whole field of knowledge that informs the movement or the writing that's set up ahead of time. But the field of knowledge that's set up doesn't determine what happens. All it does is it's a field that one draws from.
Yes.
So in the writing with, in the moving with, it's a field of knowledge that one draws from. The knowledge is often specific memories, right? It's not just facts about things. It's memories of past experiences of doing things or encountering people, for instance.
And I wouldn't even say thoughtful or conscious memory. Sometimes that comes through, and well, you'd have to speak in terms of writing, and I suppose I can to a degree as well too, but from a dancer's point of view, that's an embodied memory that shows itself, almost unconscious, beyond thought as well. And that's terribly exciting.
I'm sort of thinking out loud that this is a way that in this, well, it doesn't have to be a confrontation, but in this relationship between doing and making on the one hand and thought on the other, or knowledge, then there is a relationship without it necessarily being determinant in this Kantian sense or predefined sense, right? So, it does sort of offer possibilities.
It does.
And, I suppose in some ways, anyway, I'm not quite sure that I fully understand how that relates to the minor gesture at this point, but yeah, so maybe the minor gesture is because she identifies the minor gesture as being a gesture that destabilizes. You remember I said at some point in the first conversation that I thought that one could think things through, and she sort of said, well, yeah, but the minor gesture destabilizes rather than, so clearly we're in this, so the field of knowledge that is set up ahead of time is then destabilized by the minor gesture. I think that's what's going on there.
So is the destabilization, is that the cut that you're talking about? Or is not even close?
I think the cut has to do with recognition of difference, or it's a kind of a way that you understand something. Johnny was saying, where does, for instance, when he makes a decision about following up on reporting something going on with his clients, that decision is based on, he has to make a cut. He has to break up the problem into stuff over here and stuff over there. And that's the cut that goes into the decision. So that's the way I understand it.
I just make to add to that something. When my client sent me a letter, her letter, that to me was a minor gesture that destabilized my expectations of what she could and couldn't accomplish. Because obviously she was able to make some cuts in order to get me this letter. that I thought were way beyond her. So and I'm sure no one else expected. When I reported this to her niece, she was like astonished. You know? So that's what I'm saying. You know, the presentation, what we observe about another person and what we decide their limits are, and what we can do to help them, what we shouldn't even bother to do. I think those kinds of decisions that we make or that are made by the organization are very slippery. And so I just wanted to offer that my example here as that letter to me was a minor gesture that destabilized my frames of reference for my relationship with her. And I thought there was something she could communicate on a deeper level than I thought she could. And it enhanced my relationship with her, because I was now much more of an ally to her than I had been before, because some of those walls started to disappear. And I thought, wow, this is a very, very deep person, much deeper than I think anyone recognized. So I'm just offering that as I'm sure we've all had these surprises, some gesture that someone makes, or some comment, or some discrepancy you notice in reports that sort of make you feel like there's something missing here. I think all of those can add up in creative ways, rather than in ways that actually create chaos or decoherence. And I think so many organizations are so paranoid about chaos and decoherence, so paranoid about that they actually create it, because they make all these rules and regulations that don't apply to anything, that disrupt the flow, you know, the people who are actually making the actual decisions on the ground. So I think those are extremely perplexing issues. So thank you, Geoffrey, for pointing that out.
I guess just to add to that, I think Peter, you're right, John. Like in terms of destabilization, it does require some level of intervention or I think experimentation. I think she talks about like noticing differently, and at one point she said to even experiment with like temporalities, and sitting with something longer. And I wondered how how that would actually work in terms of experimenting with time to notice differently. She brought up, I guess in the last chapter, looking at indigenous cultures and how that waiting, that process allowed for the minor gesture to present itself in a way.
Another area I was thinking about this applies is teaching. So in teaching, typically, and the way teaching is taught in the university, it's all about method, right? It's a slew of methods that you apply to a given classroom. But of course, what goes on in the classroom has nothing to do with the methods that you go into the classroom with. It has to do with what emerges from that encounter. That's where the learning takes place. It doesn't take place in response to the method. It takes place in the encounter with the person and their ineffability, right? So.
Well, I think we're starting to shift into the next chapter, 2, which I haven't even looked at, but from the title alone, I can suspect relates to this conversation. It's on artfulness, and I don't have something exactly to say about that, but just to go with it, when you talk about teaching or any practice, professional practice, artistic practice, there's always going to be a combination of methods and of art. And what do we mean by art? Erin presented an alternative definition in this book that aligns art or rethinks it or restates it in terms of a way or a how or a what was the other word she used? A manner. So how are decisions made in art? I think they're made in the moment, right? I mean, there's a moment when you apply the paint to the canvas, when you commit the word to the page, when you strike the note on the instrument. And I understand that Erin is saying that like that moment is not comprised of a subject and an object or of a performer and performance as distinct categories. That all comes secondarily as a conceptual way of breaking apart the experience, but it is a organic, living unfolding of a potentiality. And there's agency involved. There is selfness involved in that, but not in the mode of pre-figured or pre-formatted or pre-existent monad that is performing some kind of an action in these kind of disjointed ways. So understanding things in their holistic nature, understanding things in their procedural nature, understanding things in a way that where the understanding doesn't divorce itself from the thing, that's the artfulness. That's part of the art. We'll talk about that next week, I suppose. But I think that thinking about the art of a practice is really important to do for each of us. Just make that statement as practitioners, because we come to these moments where we're faced with decision points that challenge our artfulness, that even challenge our commitment to our art. And of course, there's no right or wrong or it does. There is an ethical component to that, and there is a way in which existentially we're implied by that process. So if I make a decision artistically, professionally, in whatever context it happens to be, that is untrue, untruthful, that isn't true to what I know is the correct choice, then that creates that dissonance, that creates that that feeling, that we're not being true. I've heard in this conversation and in the previous one and in other contexts, and it's something that I'm always actively struggling with, is this dilemma around the organizational constraints or the external institutional constraints or expectations or formatting, and then what one knows ought to be done, what one dreams could be done, what one sees as a potentiality that is not accounted for, is not recognized, is not afforded space in which to unfold in the paradigm in which one happens to be working. And I'm reminded of a quote from Samuel Delany, the novel Dahlgren. I don't know if this is his original quote or if he picked it up somewhere else or that it matters, but it was and I may have this reversed, but I suppose the order doesn't matter. Be true to yourself so that you may be true to your work, and be true to your work so that you may be true to yourself. And I think that as artists, as practitioners, we're always in the dialectic of that process. We have to be true, and somehow I think, no, we ultimately will know what is the correct decision. That's the voice of conscience, if you will. It's a whole nother conversation. And what we know may or may not be compatible with our objective conditions. And if they're not, and we deny what we know, and we continue to sustain conditions that are contrary to our inner knowing, and of course I'm talking about knowing here in the way that Aaron's talking about knowing, not as objective subject-object knowledge, but as an immanent knowing. We will suffer, and we will create suffering. And if we act on what we know, then we won't avoid suffering necessarily, but we'll create the possibility for new conditions to arise, and those may or may not be successful. That's the scary thing. But I don't want to sound prescriptive here. I think it's simpler than it's simpler in a certain way than we may theorize it. And it's like, how do you let go of a rock that you're holding? You don't have to have a theory for how to do that, right? But what happens next? Hopefully you have some methods you can fall back on. So something you could draw from, because then you can enter into that meta-modeling, artfulness. And I think from those meta perspectives that open up, you could begin to more appropriately combine methods that are, help you achieve what you want to do, help you actualize what you know is true. And I think that's the process we're all in our respective ways here. And part of what is kind of the matter of concern, holding this conversation together, and maybe, moving it where it wants to go.
Can I respond to that? Unless.
Go ahead, Duff.
You mentioned Samuel Delaney, who lived a few blocks from where I live. Back in I think the 60s and the 70s, novels were first coming out. He was a very interesting guy because he's gay, he's Black, he was married to a white lesbian, and they had a daughter. So I think and he writes science fiction. And he also wrote about coming out in the 50s, when it was, of course, it was a crime, and it was also punishable. And he ended up in a psychiatric ward, I think, for a while. But I think this is, and I know Aaron was talking about Fred Moten's work, and I haven't read his book Under Commons, but I'm very curious about it. And I was Delaney is a hero of mine, as was James Baldwin. Baldwin said, Black people are inside white people, and white people are inside Black people. And I think this whole what's in and what's out is very curious. The knower, the known, the knowingness. And just a personal anecdote, I tend to go back and forth from theories and models and other people's stories and my own personal experience. Not because I'm interested in disclosing something about myself, but it's just just the way I can start to integrate all of these different models and frames of reference and different theories. So I think a strong first person is very important, and I believe James Baldwin and Delaney both have a very strong first person, and I'm sure Fred Moten does as well. But I remember I had, when I first came to New York, I come from the South, very segregated and very bigoted, and I come to New York, and I'm living in the East Village, and it's very countercultural, and I'm living with a boyfriend who's Black, and we're together one day, so there's, with a friend of his, so it's like 3 gay men, 2 Black, and myself a Caucasian, and they were talking about, and one of them said something about, oh, this white guy, he's so white, you know, and I thought about that, and a few days later I was with these same gentlemen, and you know, I said very spontaneously, I said, oh, you know, I was walking down the street and I saw this white guy, and I had an anecdote about it, and then I reflected upon that, and I thought, I had never, I think I was like 21, 22, I had never described anyone as a white guy. But I think there was something about the relationships that I was in that started to, certain things that I just had never thought about, like being a white guy, you know, started to pop up as a feature in my psychosexual, social, cultural landscape. And since then I've had many, many, many experiences with many different ethnicities and orientations, and I find that I haven't figured any of it out. What happens, you know, what happens in those liminal zones, in the in-between, when people let down their guard, when they stop promoting an ideology that's preordains everything. It's a very slippery slope. So I enjoy the way Aaron sort of makes this sort of the unknowable and the confusing and the ambiguous is actually very beautiful if we pay attention to it in a certain way. So I've grown to love ambiguity. It used to be something I would try to get rid of as much as possible. But I think it's, if you can start to love it. Yet at the same time, yes, there is right or wrong. There's right, both right and wrong, and there's neither right nor wrong. If you can hold those different logics, I think you can have more satisfying relationships and more satisfying outcomes than if you're just flying by the seat of your pants. So, thanks.
And of course, winging it or working with the spontaneity of the situation is prone to error. It's prone to pain. You know, one can cause oneself considerable pain by doing things that way, or other people pain. One can hurt people because that's part of the process. And of course, those are some of the fears that we have about doing things spontaneously. We would sometimes, I think, like to fall back on prescribed methods because if we make a mistake, we can blame the method and not ourselves.
Well, it's a matter of context too, right? Like if I'm bringing my car in to get a muffler repair or something like that, I don't need a lot of spontaneity, you know, from the mechanic. There's a certain method, a certain way to fix a broken muffler or whatever it is, and you know, I would prefer it were applied in, you know, in a precise way, as cheaply as possible, right? So it's a matter of what we're working with and context, and that's all I want to say about that. Also, there are some things that cannot be done other than in an institutional and in a highly structured context that is by definition, you know, but unavoidably pre-formatted. And so then the question is more around how that is reformed, how those structures are reformed. It doesn't make sense most of the time to start from scratch. And so we need to have spaces for disruption, we need to be able to shake off reifications. But that doesn't mean we can or should go it alone or go renegade on systems. And that is context dependent. It's easier for me to be outside of a system than inside of one, as far as academically and as a writer. But for a nurse, there are not too many freelance nurses. I suppose there are, like home care and that kind of a thing, but it's just a different profession. And so I like having this dialogue kind of across contexts, because we can see things maybe in other contexts that aren't seen from within, and vice versa. And I think that learning is occurring.
And I'm completely happy to make mistakes. I think I have my entire life since you've seen this happen because of those mistakes. So I'm happy to be in a vulnerable place with that, and to live in ambiguity and wonder and question. But at the same time, I am responsible, depending on who I'm working with, and generally that's very young, profoundly disabled children, that I have a responsibility in my own grapplings with, and my risk-taking and such, in terms of how I want to approach understanding their movement and learning from them. That I have to protect them to a certain degree. And when you set up the parameters or the circumstances for anything to happen, then that's part of my terror, I think, in coming into a room with young children that I'm not sure what's about. I have to drop all sort of knowledge and understanding and method walking into that room to let whatever's going to happen emerge from that. But at the same time, there's this part of my brain and mothering and being a mother as well too, that I need to protect them. And I've also promised to protect them ethically. Now, what's so interesting is that they could give a crap about any of that. I mean, the kinds of things that they do and the risks that they take as well too. But it's this tug of war all of the time, and what we're trying to create a scaffolding for, and what we're hoping and would imagine might come of that. And so far, my imaginations, they've exceeded anything that I've ever imagined. But there's such a tension between all of these things, such a tension.
There's something I wanted to mention. It's a bit different from the discussion we've been having. So one of the reasons why I'm drawn to Erin's work is because in my professional career, I've been working on this idea of a field of inquiry that is neither science nor art. Pat and Cora and I wrote a paper together that sort of touched on some of these issues. And when I first read Erin's ideas, when I first read an earlier version of this chapter, which was in an earlier version was an article, also called Against Method, I sort of wondered whether her idea of research creation is simply another way of talking about the work that I'm struggling in my own thing to find in this relationship between science and art that isn't quite science and isn't quite art. Because her ideas seem to have the same kind of resonances built in, but I'm not entirely convinced that it's the same idea as the one that I've been struggling to define, understand, or whatever. So, for me, it's still an open question whether or not the work that I've been doing is research creation the way she's called it, or whether it's something a bit different. So,
do you have a name for it?
I've been calling it, but nobody's happy with my. I've been calling it art and science, but Pat hates the word hybrid. Even though she agreed to co-sign the paper, but so I mean, hybrid is anyway. I'm not quite sure. It has
problem is words
that doesn't have a ring to it, I'll say.
Yeah, we're all grappling with words and words to use, and I think the back step to all of this is, what is the mind? What is the brain? What do we think is the brain? Using our brains to think about the brain. But I have to go, so sorry, guys.
Yeah, we're coming up
after that question. Okay.
Well, it really wasn't a question. It wasn't a question to be answered anyway. It was
Well, I thought that was an example, a beautiful example of a meta question.
Yeah.
So your response to the doctors. So that indicates to me there's a lot going on there that they probably weren't tracking at all.
Exactly.
Or wasn't in their models of the world. So I think that's a minor gesture, a very excellent minor gesture.
So in preparation for next time, which in 2 weeks, not 1 week, happily, because I don't think I would have it read for for next week. I'm wondering if somebody would like to take on the job of maybe not as long an introduction as I did today, but a small introduction to the text. Does anybody feel moved to do that? I mean, I'm happy to do it if nobody does, but.
Say, I always feel moved to do something like that, but at the same time, my schedule is not reliable. So maybe I'll go ahead and volunteer, and then if something comes up, then I can transfer my notes to somebody else, and we can have a shared introduction. But I don't mind doing it.
Okay, well, you can. We'll let you do it, and if you need to, you can pass it across to me, and I'll take your place. I'll be Duggan's for 15 minutes.
It's true embodiment there.
So I think we've had a really good run around the question, I think, today. So we'll call the meeting to a close, and hopefully Heather will be with us more fully next week as well. So
thank you, Jeffrey,
Thank
and
you.
everyone else.
Thank you, everybody.
thank you.
See you next
See
time.
everyone.